Anti-gravity propulsion. Is it anti-gravity and is it propulsion? We're going to take a look at a few different things here. First, I have from the Army Research Laboratory from June of 2003, force on an asymmetric capacitor. Apparently the best copy available. So this is from the Army Research Laboratory, force on an asymmetric capacitor. The second one is from NASA, October 2004, so a little bit more than a year afterward. This one is asymmetrical capacitors for propulsion. Asymmetrical capacitors for propulsion, October 2004. And then apparently from the University of Brasilia, as well as for the Department of Physics and the Institute for Plasmas and Nuclear Fusion in Portugal, Lisboa, or Lisbon as we might know it. And that one is 2010. In between those, we have Paul A. LaViollette's book, Secrets of Anti-Gravity Propulsion from 2008. So, is anti-gravity propulsion, is it anti-gravity, and is it propulsion? Well, let's take a look at the Army Research Laboratory's asymmetric capacitor, the force on an asymmetric capacitor from Army Research Laboratory. And disclaimer on this, it says that the findings in this report are not to be construed as an official Department of the Army position, unless so designated by other authorized documents. Citation of manufacturers or trade names does not constitute an official endorsement or approval of the use thereof. So the authors of the Army Research Laboratory report, Force on an Asymmetric Capacitor, are Thomas B. Bader and Christian Fazzi, and from the Sensors and Electron Devices Directorate, Army Research Laboratory. So let's see, the report document page, got all that. U.S. Army Laboratory. So there's a few things. I'll go the contents of this we have in right here. This is the contents. There's an introduction. The Byfield-Brown effect, which is significant to me from the first of me hearing of it, was in T. Townsend, not T. Townsend Brown. That's who the Byfield-Brown effect is named after, but from Secrets of Anti-Gravity Propulsion by Paul A. LaViolette. And so then three preliminary experiments at the Army Research Laboratory, previously proposed explanations for the Byfield-Brown force, which I'll actually get into that, thermodynamic analysis of the Byfield-Brown force, summary and suggested future work, references Appendix A and Appendix B, which are short patent history dealing with asymmetric capacitors, and Appendix B, force on asymmetric capacitor in a vacuum. All right, so this, again, the Army Research Laboratory paper is from June of 2003. So June of 2003. Let's take a look at the introduction. It says, recently there is a great deal of interest in the Byfield-Brown effect, i.e. when high voltage, that's around 30 kilovolts, is applied to the electrodes of an asymmetric capacitor. Right? So when a high voltage, around 30 kilovolts, is applied to the electrodes of an asymmetric capacitor, a net force is observed on the capacitor. By asymmetric, we mean that the physical dimensions of the two electrodes are different, i.e. one electrode is large and the other small. According to the classical Byfield-Brown effect, see Brown's original 1960, 1962, and 1965 patents cited in Appendix A and a partial reproduction in Section 2, The largest force on the capacitor is in a direction from the negative, the larger electrode, toward the positive, smaller electrode. Right? So the largest force is in a direction from the negative or larger electrode toward the positive, smaller electrode. That means that the positive electrode, the force is going from the big negative to the small positive. So it even, you can look at it like that greater or less than sign, right? It's like an arrow. So the force starts from the open end and goes towards the smaller closed end, toward the point, right? So that it would be going in that direction. Okay, so today there are numerous demonstrations of this effect on the internet in devices called lifters, which show that the force on the capacitor exceeds its weight. In fact, these experiments indicate that there is a force on the capacitor independent of polarity of applied voltage. In the future, the Bifield-Brown effect may have application to aircraft or vehicle propulsion with no moving parts. At the present time, there is no accepted detailed theory to explain this effect, and hence the potential of this effect for applications is unknown. The authors are aware of only 2 reports and theoretical papers that address such issues, and they're listed here 3 and 4. In section 2, we describe the history of the Bifield-Brown effect. The effect of a net force on an asymmetric capacitor is so surprising that we carried out preliminary simple experiments at the U.S. Army Research Laboratory to verify that the effect is real. The results of these experiments are described in section 3. Section 4 contains estimates of the force on the capacitor for the case of ballistic ionic wind and drift of carriers across the capacitor's gap between electrodes. In section 5, we present a detailed thermodynamic treatment of the forces on an asymmetric capacitor, assuming that a nonlinear dielectric fluid fills the region between capacitor electrodes. Section 6 is the summary and recommendation for future experimental and theoretical work. I'm going to jump to one of the conclusions here. I'll come back to some of this stuff in a bit, but so what we have here, there's actually even really there's a copy of a letter from T. Townsend Brown in the back there, which maybe I'll look at. But this is the summary and suggestion for future work in the back here. I mean, they've got an analysis of the Bifield. I mean, this is a really good paper, the Army Research Laboratory. But the summary here is we have presented a brief history of the Bifield-Brown effect. A net force is observed on an asymmetric capacitor when a high voltage bias is applied. The physical mechanism responsible for this effect is unknown. In section 4, we have presented estimates of the force on the capacitor due to the effect of an ionic wind and due to charge drift between capacitor electrodes. The force due to ionic wind is at least 3 orders of magnitude too small. The force due to charge drift is plausible. However, the estimates are only scaling estimates, not a microscopic model. In section 5, we have presented a detailed thermodynamic theory of the net force on a capacitor that is immersed in a non-linear dielectric fluid such as air in a high electric field. The main result for the net force on the capacitor is given in equation 33. The thermodynamic theory requires knowledge of the dielectric properties of the fluid surrounding the capacitor plates. It is not possible to measure, or it is not possible to estimate the various contributions to the force until we have detailed knowledge about the high field dielectric properties of the fluid. Okay. More experimental and theoretical work is needed to gain an understanding of the Bifield-Brown effect. As discussed, the most pressing question is whether the Bifield-Brown effect occurs in vacuum. This is very important, especially when I get to the book Secrets of Anti-Gravity Propulsion by Paul A. LaViolette, PhD. Okay, so the most pressing question is whether the Byfield-Brown effect occurs in a vacuum or in vacuum. It seems that Brown may have tested the effect in vacuum, but not reported it. More recently, and that's in Appendix B, more recently, there is some preliminary work that tested the effect in vacuum and claimed that there is some small effect, smaller than the force observed in air. See the second report cited in reference 2. Further work must be done to understand the effect in detail. A set of experiments must be performed in vacuum and at various gas pressures to determine the force versus voltage and current. A careful study must be made of the force as a function of gas species and gas pressure. In order to test the thermodynamic theory presented here, the dielectric properties of the gas must be carefully measured. On the theoretical side, a microscopic model of the capacitor for a given geometry must be constructed taking into account the complex physics of ionization of air or other gas in the presence of high electric fields. Only by understanding the Byfield-Brown effect in detail can its potential for application be evaluated. All right, so significant that is June of 2003 at the Army Research Laboratory. So the very next thing that follows up is actually from the researchers at NASA, and they actually cite this paper, which was the year previous to it. And so this one is October of 2004. The authors are Francis X. Canning, Corey Melcher, and Edwin West for the Institute for Scientific Research, Incorporated in Fairmont, West Virginia, not too far from where I am right now. And so let's take a look at this. All right. So, and this one's called Asymmetrical Capacitors for Propulsion, again, October of 2004. Let's take a look at the abstract here. And it says, asymmetrical capacitor thrusters have been proposed as a source of propulsion. For over 80 years, it has been known that a thrust results when a high voltage is placed across an asymmetrical capacitor, when that voltage causes a leakage current to flow. Remember, asymmetrical simply means that we're going from a bigger to a smaller size in the electrode. And in the Army Research Laboratory, that was showing that the charge started at a larger electrode that had a negative charge, and it flowed towards the smaller electrode with a positive charge. Okay, so for over 80 years, it's been known that a thrust results when a high voltage is placed across an asymmetrical capacitor, when that voltage causes a leakage current to flow. However, there is surprisingly little experimental or theoretical data explaining this effect. This paper reports on the results of tests of several asymmetrical capacitor thrusters, ACTs. The thrust they produce has been measured for various voltages, polarities, and ground configurations, and their radiation in the very high frequency range has been recorded. These tests were performed at atmospheric pressure and at various reduced pressures. So these tests were performed at atmospheric pressure, meaning the normal pressure of the air around us, right? And at various reduced pressures. So that would be going closer towards vacuum. And a simple model for the thrust was developed. The model assumed the thrust was due to electrostatic forces on the leakage current flowing across the capacitor. It was further assumed that this current involves charged ions, which undergo multiple collisions with air. These collisions transfer momentum. All of the measured data was consistent with this model. So again, this is very important here. They're saying that the model assumed the thrust was due to electrostatic forces on the leakage current flowing across the capacitor. Right? And remember, the Army Research Laboratory showed this leakage current flowing across the capacitor was going from the electrodes, from the larger negative to the smaller positive, right? So, and the two things are, one, that the thrust was due to electrostatic forces on the leakage current flowing across the capacitor, and two, it was further assumed that this current involves charged ions which undergo multiple collisions with air, and these collisions transfer momentum. All of the measured data was consistent with this model. Many configurations were tested, and the results suggest general design principles for ACTs to be used for a variety of purposes. Remember, ACTs are the asymmetrical capacitor thrusters, and what they're saying here is that these multiple configurations were tested, and the results suggest general design principles for ACTs to be used for a variety of purposes. They go through some prior experiments here in the introduction, and this is worth noting again because it talks about T. Townsend Brown, as did the Army Research Laboratory researchers. It says prior experiments. So it says sometime before entering college in 1922, Thomas Townsend Brown observed that a force is produced on a Coolidge tube when a high voltage is applied. Since then, it has been found that a force is produced when a high voltage is applied to many other asymmetrical capacitors as well. Brown received multiple patents in the US and one in Great Britain for his work. This effect is called the Byfield-Brown effect. It was discovered while T.T. Brown was in graduate school working under his advisor, Dr. Paul Alfred Byfield. While it is generally accepted that such an asymmetrical capacitor produces thrust, there is not a similar agreement on the mechanism responsible for the force produced. The purpose of this paper is to provide new test results and an analysis of those results to resolve this question. So, and this is continuing to worth noting here. So there's a long history of interest in these devices. Some of the things I actually highlighted on here earlier were, one, there is no clear consensus on how a force is produced. A simple theory based on well-known elementary physical principles. It says that all of the experimental data, and these are the highlights, was found to be consistent with the theory and numerical simulations for most designs, but not for all, as our test data shows. The direction of the force is independent of the polarity of the applied voltage, but instead depends on the asymmetry of the capacitor. And again, the asymmetry was was a size difference. In the Army Research Laboratory, they had the larger size of the electrode capacitor was negative, and it flowed towards the positive. So it wasn't about the polarity, it was about the asymmetry. But remember, they said here for most designs, but not for all. The direction of the force is independent of the polarity of the applied voltage, but instead depends on the asymmetry of the capacitor. It says also for the velocities of the ejected material that might be expected to result from thermal or electrostatic forces, the amount of material that would be needed to be removed is much greater than that available. For some configurations, the leakage current flows in bursts called Trikel pulses. All right. So we've got the different tests performed, so on and so forth, but let's look at the conclusion in the summary here and see what they have to say on the conclusion. So the conclusion reads, a series of careful tests have been performed on asymmetrical capacitor thrusters, ACTs. Right? In the past, several mechanisms have been proposed for the thrust that they produce. These mechanisms were considered both on theoretical grounds and by comparison with test results. All of the mechanisms considered were eliminated except one. A simple model was developed of ions drifting from one electrode to the other under electrostatic forces and imparting momentum to air as they underwent multiple collisions. This model was found to be consistent with all of our observations. So something I want to pause here, because this is very interesting and significant in that what they're talking about still, because some of the things that I've talked about before about the so-called anti-gravity propulsion is that, at least in the way that Paul A. LaViolette talks about it, and maybe that T. Townsend Brown was hinting at, is that it shouldn't be, first of all, anti-gravity, nor could it be considered propulsion, because it wouldn't be ejecting something and colliding, as in Newton's third law of motion, which is for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, as we most know of all the propulsion systems that we use, right? But this says here something otherwise, and this actually sounds like something that Einstein discovered earlier, which was about these electrostatic forces. Einstein's theories actually led to the creation of photovoltaic cells, or to what we know as solar power, right, panels, because of the collisions of photons with electrons and giving them some force, right? That's how that works. The photons hit the electrons in the circuit and it pushes them through, right? That's basically that type of force there that Einstein discovered. So this here, it says all of the mechanisms considered were eliminated except one. A simple model was developed of ions drifting from one electrode to the other under electrostatic forces and imparting momentum to air as they underwent multiple collisions. Now, why is this similar? Because it's a collision. Just like billiard balls, right? You hit a pool ball, it hits another one and bounces. It's a collision and it imparts that force, right? And in doing that, by simply ejecting, just like the recoil on a gun, if you fire a gun, right, boom, it recoils back from the force, right? So and it causes a collision. And like if somebody were to get, or a target gets hit by that force, it moves the target, right, or punches a hole through it. So this model was found to be consistent with all of our observations. It predicted, and here's a little bit of an explanation of how it was consistent with all of their observations. It predicted the magnitude of the force thrust that was measured. It also predicted how the direction of the thrust changed when the location of the ground wire changed. So changing the direction, it showed, so they were able to predict that it was that the force was generated by these collisions. Okay. Furthermore, it also predicted that the direction of the thrust was independent of the polarity of the applied voltage. Finally, it qualitatively predicted how the magnitude of the thrust varied as the design of the ACT, its shape, etc., varied over many such design changes. It may be concluded that the ion drift model explains how a thrust is developed by ions pushing on air. Again, it may be concluded that the ion drift model explains how a thrust is developed by ions pushing on air. Again, this is propulsion, right? And again, why I'm emphasizing that is because a lot of the talk about anti-gravity should not be anti-gravity, and it should not propulsion in the classic sense, right? So again, it may be concluded that the ion drift model explains how a thrust is developed by ions pushing on air. Tests were also performed in nitrogen and argon and were performed at reduced pressures. A thrust was also produced at moderately reduced pressures when the ACT, remember the asymmetric capacitor thruster, when the ACT produced a current flow without causing a breakdown of the air or other gas. In spite of decades of speculation about possible new physical principles, being responsible for the thrust produced by ACTs and lifters, we find no evidence to support such a conclusion. On the contrary, we find that their operation is fully explained by a very simple theory that uses only electrostatic forces and the transfer of momentum by multiple collisions. Again, this brings us way back to classical physics in that it's collisions, and that's what's causing the thrust. And they said that it was predictable, so it was consistent with their observations. All right. Now, so that was, remember, the Army Research Laboratory did their research and asked for more research to be done in June of 2003. Well, these NASA scientists responded in October of 2004. And I say responded because I do know in here that they mentioned the Army Research Laboratory test in their, let's see, I know it's in here somewhere. Yes, right here. So it was an interest in ACTs and lifters continues today. Jonathan Campbell of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center has designed and tested ACTs that use dielectrics to increase their thrust, receiving U.S. patents for his work in 2001 and 2002. And then he goes on to say, Thomas Bader and Chris Fozzi of the Army Research Laboratory in Delphi, see, there it goes, their names right there. So Fozzi of the Army Research Lab in Delphi, Maryland, have recently reported work on the subject. They constructed multiple devices, both original and reproductions of designs found on the internet, and made qualitative observations. Bader and Fozzi's paper includes a brief history and an attempt at an explanation of the cause of force observed. However, they conclude that at present, the physical basis for the Byfield-Brown effect is not understood. J.L. Naudin and others have constructed devices similar to the original Brown patent and then assembled multiple devices into larger design to create lifters that perform similarly to De Seversky's craft. These designs vary greatly in size and shape. Some are multiple cells or have stacked layers of cells to create more efficient and more powerful devices. But again, as you can see, the NASA paper cites the earlier research of the Army Research Laboratory, which when I at first looked these up, I didn't know that, but it was nice and serendipitous because it's a good flow from one to the next. But before I get into the last paper, which is the most recent year of publication of that, we're going to look at what I have here on my tablet. I have the Secrets of Anti-Gravity Propulsion, and there's a section here that says electrogravitics goes black. All right. And this is from Paul A. LaViolette's book, Secrets of Anti-Gravity Propulsion. So, and this is addressing some of the things that so-called conspiracy theorists would be talking about why it would be said that no results have been found and no explanations have been found, even though this NASA paper shows that it has to do with electrostatic forces and ionic collisions in the atmosphere, and those are imparting thrust. So here we go. We have this section, electrogravitics goes black, right away, starting with Paul A. LaViolette writing about T. Townsend Brown. 3.5, electrogravitics goes black. When Brown began working on this AC electrogravitic resonator concept, he may have been getting too close to something that governments considered top secret. Around 1959, there was a substantial change in openness about anti-gravity research. Earlier, during the mid-1950s, aerospace companies did not hide from the public the fact that they were conducting electrogravitics R&D, although they generally kept the particulars of their own work confidential. For example, an article by A.V. Cleaver from Rolls-Royce's Aero Engine Division indicates that as of the beginning of 1957, secrecy had not been imposed but might be imminent. The article states, "The fact that there appears to be no very high security rating attached to it in itself suggests that definite results have not yet been achieved. If and when they are, one would expect the usual clamp to be tightened down." Openness continued. even into the early part of 1958, with the subject inspiring heated discussion at a January aeronautical science meeting in New York. Just prior to the event, Product Engineering magazine carried the following news brief: Electrogravitics, Science or Daydream. A few weeks from now, at a special session of the Institute of the Aeronautical Sciences, New York City, January 27th to the 31st, a group of dedicated men will discuss what some people label pure science fiction, but others believe is an attainable goal. The subject: Electrogravitics, the science of controlling gravity. After exploring various notions of gravity, the article finally concludes: perhaps British aeronautical engineer A.V. Cleaver is right in insisting that if any anti-gravity device is to be developed, the first thing needed is a new principle in fundamental physics, not just a new invention or application of known principles. Nevertheless, the Air Force is encouraging research in electrogravitics, and many companies and individuals are working on the problem. After the meeting, Business Week magazine reported the following: if anyone had predicted 10 years ago that a cross-section of the nation's top physicists, aeronautical engineers, and mathematicians would be fighting for standing room to hear the chaste theory of gravity seriously challenged, he would have been labeled sunstroked, senile, or worse. At an opening day meeting of the Institute of Aeronautical Sciences in New York last week, however, the impossible became possible. In record numbers, in a rush that stacked up scientists 20 deep at every entrance to the Sheraton Astor's North Ballroom, the elite of research came to hear what it is that has reawakened scientific interest in the possibility of doing something about gravitation. What has happened, they wanted to know, that has caused major aircraft companies, as well as the government and various universities, to start serious inquiries into the possibility of controlling gravity. How do the recent discoveries in anti-proton research fit into the picture? And even more importantly, how accurate are the reports circulated by TASS that Russian scientists hope to turn up some sort of machinery to cancel or modify the force of gravity sometime during 1958? Business Week went on to go and list an impressive array of companies and institutions backing gravity research. Companies such as the Glenn Martin Company, Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, Lockheed Aircraft Corporation, Sperry Rand Corporation, the Army Transportation Research and Development Command, Princeton University, the University of North Carolina, and the University of California. Hughes Aircraft should also be added to the list of organizations that by 1958 had become involved in anti-gravity research. Yet this climate of openness began to change very soon after, as companies became increasingly silent about their involvement in gravity research. Okay, so this is where Paul A. LaViolette is talking about that electrogravitics goes black. And for the conspiracy theorists out there, already we looked at the Army Research Laboratory paper that was published in June of 2003. They said that more research needed to be done. They do not understand the mechanism of how the thrust is created. Then we took a brief look also at NASA's paper on asymmetrical capacitor propulsion, and they said that consistent with their observations, right, the predictions that they made were consistent with their observations, which is that the electrostatic forces and ion drift are responsible for the thrust when there are collisions with the atmosphere, with the air, and they've done it at varying different pressures, and so they found the reason for the thrust, and they also proposed various suggestions for how different configurations can be used for various different devices for propulsion. Okay, so now, but even then, this book was published after that. So remember, Paul A. LaViollette's book, what I'm reading from now, The Secrets of Anti-Gravity Propulsion, was published 4 years after the NASA research that said that they found the mechanism for it. Remember, the Army Research Laboratory paper that we looked at earlier says they didn't know and more research was needed. That same paper was cited by the NASA research team, and they also found, well, we did that further research and we found the mechanism of the thrust was the electrostatic forces, collisions with the air, ionic drift, so on. And then we have now in 2008 Paul A. LaViolette talking about electrogravitics goes black, because that's one of the names for the anti-gravity research is electrogravitics. So let's continue to see what he has to say about this. He says, yet this climate of openness began to change very soon after, as companies became increasingly silent about their involvement in gravity research. In the July 1959 issue of Canadian Aviation, Charles Carew wrote, the author has not been able to determine whether the Glenn L. Martin Corp. Has discontinued its anti-gravity program or made a significant discovery which has elevated it to super top secret category, since no information about the project has recently been available. This indicated that Glenn Martin had made a decided turnabout from its unusually outspoken support of electrogravitics. Let me say that again. This indicated that Glenn Martin had made a decided turnabout from its unusually outspoken support of electrogravitics, evident in its vice president's statement to the press in 1955. Most probably, anti-gravity research had begun to be funded by the military and as a result had continued under a cloak of secrecy. This could explain the difficulty Brown had been encountering in promoting his ideas. During this period, he had been slowly and patiently giving demonstrations for the Pentagon and key aerospace companies in the United States, hoping to generate some interest in his work. But success continually eluded him. In the Philadelphia experiment, Moore wrote that such interest as he was able to generate seemed to melt away almost as fast as it developed, almost as if someone, or perhaps something, was working against him. I don't know what the hell that means. In parentheses it says, or something? What do they mean? It's like a veiled reference to non-human intelligences. All right. As mentioned earlier, beginning in 1959, Brown was invited to work on a consulting basis with Agnew Bonson Jr. to investigate electrogravitic propulsion, together with Dr. Frank King. They had explored methods of applying AC fields to electrified disks. An examination of Bonson's laboratory notebook shows that on January 5th, 1958, he had suggested to Brown a variation of the AC electric field concept. Bonson's idea was to place a parabolic metal grid between a positively charged parabolic lift canopy and a negatively charged sphere, as shown in Figure 3.9. That's interesting. A parabolic metal grid between a positively charged parabolic lift canopy and a negatively charged sphere. In Figure 3.9, where is that? Let's take a look. Okay, the canopy. So the sphere is smaller and a positive charge. But it says the lift. And here the lift is going towards the positive, even though some of the other work showed that it has nothing to do with the charge polarity. But this here is showing the negative here and the positive there. And then we have this is the lift solid canopy. So it's parabolic shaped, negative to positive, which is indicating that the lift wants to go that way, up, right? Because these are the lifters that they talked about before. So, and in contrast to what was spoken about before, an asymmetric capacitor thrust, I mean, this technically can be considered smaller, at least in the area, whereas this canopy has a larger surface area. It might be thinner and maybe less dense. So this is still asymmetrical in probably a couple of ways. Well, one, we can see the asymmetry, though, is that this is smaller and this is going to larger, which means the thrust should go the other way, according to some of the other papers. But it may be that the asymmetry here is that this is more dense, more material, and the canopy is thinner. And so this could be considered larger, as in if we consider to be the mass. But we'll see what's going on here. All right, so continuing. So openness has left, and okay, so we were at, it says, so Bonson's idea was to place a parabolic metal grid between a positively charged parabolic lift canopy and a negatively charged sphere, as shown in figure 3.9. Then he applied an oscillating high voltage field between the lift canopy and the negative sphere. He chose a megahertz frequency for this oscillating field that would establish a resonant stationary wave between the two electrodes. Already, a lot of this is... these are not the methods that were tested in the Army Research Laboratory paper that I have, or the NASA paper here. They didn't replicate this device in any of that research. I'll continue. Okay, so he chose a megahertz frequency for this oscillating field that would establish a resonant stationary wave between the two electrodes. He hypothesized that this electrostatic stationary wave would somehow store the energy of the applied AC field in an ether-like energy reservoir residing in the space immediately around the test device. Now, some people may be rolling their eyes because it's talking about ether, but Paul Elavila, in his book, he does have an etheric explanation, and it deals with his something that he developed called subquantum kinetics. We'll see if we get to that. So he felt that this resonant condition might allow the latent energy in this stationary field to be used with a minimum of power consumption. So here we see Bonson hitting upon this same key idea of a field-induced soliton phenomenon. Bonson also described the use of alternating current fields in a U.S. patent that he filed in September 1964 on an electrogravitic levitation device. And it says see figure 310. All right, we'll look at that in a second. The data in his patent indicate that his test rig had developed a thrust of 100 grams at 150 kilovolts, with thrust increasing exponentially according to the 2.6 power of voltage. This performance was comparable to the levitating rigs that Brown had tested, which again leads us to suspect that Brown was using AC to get the impressive results that his friend Kitzelman had witnessed. Shortly after Bonson filed his patent, tragedy struck. He was killed under somewhat unusual circumstances when his private airplane reportedly struck a high-tension wire. I guess I can already hear the brains of the conspiracy theorists going off, that he filed his patent and then he was killed under unusual circumstances when his private airplane reportedly struck a high-tension wire. All right. His patent, which was issued in December 1965, was assigned to his estate. His heirs, having no interest in further developing Bonson's anti-gravity work, sold his patents to another company. Brown's electrokinetic apparatus and his electric generator patents, 3,187,206 and 3,196,296, were issued several months before Bonson's, in June and July 1965. Brown's patents were assigned to the Electrokinetics Corporation, a company that Philadelphia businessman Martin Decker had formed in collaboration with Brown to develop Brown's electrokinetic devices. The company was located in the Philadelphia suburb of Bala Sinwi, where Decker was operating an industrial compound. This was only 8 miles from the General Electric Space Center in King of Prussia, where Brown had conducted vacuum chamber experiments in 1959. Brown had consulted for electrokinetics since the early 1960s and had received a considerable quantity of stock in the company in exchange for the assignment of his patent rights. In his biography of Brown, Shatskin writes that in the summer of 1964, Decker had told Brown that his electrokinetic stock had become worthless. Nevertheless, the company must have continued to function, as patents of Brown's issued as late as 1967 are listed as being assigned to electrokinetics. Some mystery appears to surround this company's circumstances. I want to take a look at Figure 310, an electrogravitic thrust-producing device as illustrated in Bonson's 1965 patent. And it's got the similar design with the parabolic plates. Alright, so let's take a look here. Alright, so there's some stuff, this is a lot that Paul Elevide is talking about. I'm going to read through the rest of this because he says some mystery appears to surround this company's circumstances. So what could he mean? Whatever does he mean? All right. Electrokinetics Corporation kept its electrogravitics work veiled in secrecy because in 1968, in a letter to Terman, Brown wrote, "The company to which I serve as consultant has not released some of the information you have requested, and I am very much at a loss to know what to say." This shroud of secrecy over Brown's work apparently continued into the 1980s, because in February 1982, responding to an Illinois gentleman inquiring about the status of his work, he wrote, "I regret to advise you that electrogravitic research has been taken over in its entirety by a California corporation which has imposed secrecy, at least until their investigations are completed. No further publication or release of information is permitted, possibly until next year." Was this California corporation Lockheed Martin, or was it Hughes Aircraft? Brown did not say. After his brief consulting work for electrokinetics in the early 1960s, Brown went into semi-retirement, and by 1970 had dropped most of his applied electrogravitic work to busy himself with research on petroelectricity, or so it seemed. Brown died of natural causes in 1985. Until the time of his death, details about the use of pulsating fields in his electrogravitics research were not forthcoming. Classification restrictions or concerns for trade secrecy presumably discouraged him from openly saying much about this aspect of his work. Moore's biography of Brown paints a picture of someone who was ahead of his time, yet not understood by most of his colleagues. Of an inventor who was confronted by one discouragement after another in his attempts to secure government funding, and who finally gave up electrogravitic propulsion research at the end of the 1960s. However, one source close to the Brown family indicates that this was not the case, that Brown was being kept in the loop of the secret aerospace research he had catalyzed, and that the switch to petroelectricity research was primarily a cover. The public exposure he had received in the past due to media attention to his electric disc technology would have made him a potential security threat. Thus, it is understandable that when the military began seriously funding his ideas, the work would have been contracted to a large aerospace company, with Brown being allowed to consult in private as long as he kept quiet about his involvement. Although Brown was probably legitimately pursuing petroelectricity research, which also included the work he was doing at Stanford Research Institute, this openly acknowledged work must not have occupied him full time. He apparently had obtained high-level clearance and was also quietly consulting on a secret military project that was implementing his electrogravitic propulsion ideas. As described in Chapter 5, Brown's electrokinetic technology was eventually incorporated into the B-2 Advanced Technology Bomber, serving as its primary means of propulsion. In effect, the B-2 is the realization of the concept Brown first proposed in Project Winterhaven. Its electrogravitic technology would probably have remained a secret were it not for information leaked by a group of engineers who were part of the inner circle working on such super-secret projects. It seems that the optimistic projections that electrogravitic vehicles would be commonly used for commercial flight have not come to pass as of the present date. Caru's investigations into the unpublicized gravity control research being conducted all over the globe in 1959 at that time led him to believe that the technique for effectively controlling gravity would be mastered within the lifetime of his readers. The February 1956 Aviation Studies report was even more optimistic. It estimated that the development of a prototype anti-gravity combat disc was only 10 years away. It predicted that the 20th century would be divided in half. Whereas air transport during the first half had used aerodynamic principles, heat engines, and flapping controls, it predicted that the second half would arise as a radical offshoot with no ties to past aviation science, and that in this new era, electrical energy would serve as the catalyst to motion. Gravity, the bitter foe in the first half of the century, would become the great provider in the second half. However, almost half a century later, we still find commercial aviation using the sledgehammer approach, employing jet and rocket propulsion technologies. Still, these early predictions were partially correct. Gravity control did become practically applied, but not for commercial use. As described in subsequent chapters, anti-gravity vehicles have been developed for the military and are being flown in large numbers, but knowledge of their existence is being kept a closely guarded secret. That's interesting. Paul A. LaViolette says that in his book. The next chapter is Chapter 4. It has an etheric explanation, starting with the new classified physics. But before that, I want to take a look finally, and then we'll get back into some more of that fun stuff, conspiracy theory stuff. Before that, we can take a look at this final paper from 2010 from the guy in Brazil and in Portugal called The Study on the Influence that the Number of Positive Ion Sources has in the propulsion efficiency of an asymmetric capacitor in nitrogen gas. So again, that's a long name. Study on the influence that the number of positive ion sources has in the propulsion efficiency of an asymmetric capacitor in nitrogen gas. Okay? So they're looking at the influence that the number of positive ion sources has in propulsion efficiency. All right. So let's look at the abstract and then the conclusion and see what they say. Now, this is 2 years after Paul A. LaViolette's book, Secrets of Anti-Gravity Propulsion. They're doing this more as an electrohydrodynamic research, which the term was going around back in the 50s as well, and as called magnetohydrodynamics. But let's look at the abstract, what it says. Okay, it says, the present one, the author is Martins and Pinheiro. Okay, the present work intends to compare the propulsion force developed in an asymmetric capacitor according to the number of positive ion sources used. The ion source is a corona wire, which generates a positive corona discharge in nitrogen gas directed towards the ground electrode. Okay, so it's directed towards the ground, down, right? So the corona wire, right, generates a positive corona discharge, positive charge, in a nitrogen gas directed towards the ground electrode, right? We are going to apply the known theory of electrohydrodynamics and electrostatics in order to compute all hydrodynamic and electrostatic forces that act on the considered geometry in an attempt to provide a physical insight on the force mechanism that acts on each asymmetrical capacitor and to compare the propulsion efficiencies. This is a little bit different from some of the other work because they're specifically using a medium and they're using what they know about the theory of electrohydrodynamics. And what did they conclude in this paper? Okay, their conclusion says, the physical origin of the force that acts on an asymmetrical capacitor is electrostatic. This is a conclusion from the NASA scientists, right? It's electrostatic. They talked about the electrostatic forces of discharges colliding with the air, and that produced the thrust, right? The ion flow. So they say this here: the physical origin of the force that acts on an asymmetrical capacitor is electrostatic, with a component always superior to 94.4% on all cases, mainly concentrated on the ground electrode. The electrostatic force vectors on the wire are much stronger than that on the ground electrode. All right, so the electrostatic force vectors are much stronger than on the wire, the one that's discharging, right? The arc are much stronger than that on the ground electrode. But since it is mostly symmetric around the wire, the main electrostatic force will be on the ground electrode, where the electrostatic force is much smaller but applied to a much larger surface and therefore significant. The generated ion wind is a reaction to the electrostatic thrust mechanism and not the cause of the thrusting force as it is usually conceived. So that's a little bit different. So first, remember, the Army Research Laboratory said they don't know. The NASA research suggested part of the ion wind, the ion flow, and also collisions having to do with the thrust. And here they're saying that the generated ion wind is a reaction to the electrostatic thrust mechanism and not the cause of the thrusting force as it is usually conceived. The main thrust force on the electrodes is electrostatic, not hydrodynamic. The main thrust force on the electrodes is electrostatic, not hydrodynamic, and that's consistent with the NASA research. Increasing the number of wires will not necessarily increase the generated force. In fact, the highest air velocity decreases with the increase of the number of wires, most probably due to the electric field decrease in each wire due to the interaction between neighboring wires. The most efficient configuration is with 2 corona wires, where the electrostatic force component is highest, perhaps due to the induction of a uniform and wider distribution of positive ions above the surface of the ground electrode. Remember, that's where the corona discharge is happening, from the corona wire down to the ground electrode. All right, so that is some more. And their conclusion was that the physical origin of the force on an asymmetrical capacitor is electrostatic. That's the NASA conclusion. If there are collisions, this is not very much different from any type of thrust or propulsion dealing with Newtonian mechanics. even in that it's a type of propulsion, something colliding with and pushing back, right? And it some of it reminds me again of electromotive force, dealing with photon collisions with electrons in photovoltaic cells. I think that's called the photoelectric effect. I didn't mention that earlier because it slipped in my mind, but it's the photoelectric effect. And that's when like a pool ball, photon hits a electron and moves it across a wire or circuit, and that's where you get the photovoltaic. Photovoltaic literally explains the effect. It's photons creating a voltage. Remember, voltage usually is thought of as a charge difference, right? Whereas if you have mostly positrons or electron holes on one side, right? So a positive charge, and then you have a bunch of negative on one side, it's going to want to equalize itself, come to a state of equilibrium, and so the negative charges discharge from where they are to the positive side. They flow in that direction. Well, with a photoelectric effect, you have photons colliding with the electrons, and those are causing that voltage. They call it photovoltaic because the voltage really usually thought of as a pressure or an asymmetrical charge imbalance, and then the charge is wanting to stabilize, whereas the photoelectric effect is knocking them, and that's what this reminds me of in this research in these asymmetric capacitor thrusters. And in that final paper said that electrostatic force is responsible. The NASA paper said just as much. So now we can take a little bit of time to finish with some of the more fantastical ideas. If we look at so-called secrets of anti-gravity propulsion, Paul Éluard-Violet significantly deviates from the Army Research Laboratory and NASA research papers that I looked at earlier here, and where we have both the Army Research Laboratory says they don't understand the force, followed up a year later by NASA said that they found it to be the electrostatic, and then the paper in 2010 also confirming just as much. But let's take a look a little bit at what Paul Éluard-Violet says about the new classified physics. Okay. So, the new classified physics. All right. And they also talk about the Byfield-Brown effect. Okay, so he says, as we discussed in Chapter 1, the Byfield-Brown effect proved to be puzzling to scientists right from the start because of its departure from prevailing theories of gravitation held by classical field theory and general relativity. Einstein's space warping equations, for example, failed to predict a connection between electrostatics and gravitation. The following passage from Aviation Report illustrates this confusion. Meanwhile, Glenn Martin now feels ready to say in public that they are examining the unified field theory to see what can be done. It would probably be truer to say that Martin and other companies are now looking for men who can make some kind of sense out of Einstein's equations. There's nobody in the air industry at present with the faintest idea of what electrogravitics, is all about. Aviation Report, November 19, 1954. Noting that modern physics did not shed much light on the electrogravitics phenomenon, the Aviation Studies February 1956 report speculates that an answer might be forthcoming from discoveries providing new insights into the physics of subatomic particles. It suggests that atom smasher experiments and abstruse field theory calculations might turn up useful leads. The scientific establishment provided little help in carrying out needed basic research into electrogravitics because its members refused to believe that such an effect could exist. The complacency of the conventional scientific world pertaining to this line of investigation is typified by the response of scientists at the U.S. National Bureau of Standards Laboratory in Boulder, Colorado. Of any government scientific laboratory, this one should have made it its business to be doing basic research into electrogravitic phenomena. Yet, in 1985, I asked their expert on gravity measurement, Dr. James Fowler, and he says Paul A. LaViolette, the author of Secrets of Anti-Gravity Propulsion, saying that he asked this person. So he says, yet in 1985, I asked their expert on gravity measurement, Dr. James Fowler, whether he knew of anyone who had done experimental research investigating a possible coupling between charge and gravitational mass. He replied that he knew of no such research. When I asked him why no one had carried out such a study, he answered, because there has been no interest. Nevertheless, since 1956, when the Aviation Studies Electrogravitic Systems report was written, there have been vast improvements both in understanding the theory behind the electrogravitics phenomenon and in developing hardware. But most of this work has been carried out in Air Force black projects. In 1992, I had an interesting telephone conversation with a man who is one of the group of informants mentioned in Chapter 5, whose stunning revelation about the B-2 bomber were published in Aviation Week and Space Technology. Although he gave me his full name, I will identify him as Ray for reasons of confidentiality. Ray claimed to have worked on a number of black R&D projects and to have been in contact with certain other black world researchers. He told me that the physics theories that academics and most laboratory physicists currently understand, teach, and write about are grossly in error. A very advanced and much more accurate theoretical framework has been developed by scientists of the black programs community, but its fundamentals presently remain classified. From the standpoint of this new physics, modern physics concepts used in the conventional world, such as relativity theory, quantum electrodynamics, and quantum mechanics, are referred to as classical concepts. That is, they are regarded as terribly outdated. That's interesting, right? Relativity theory, quantum electrodynamics, and quantum mechanics are referred to as classical concepts. And that's in this, from the standpoint of this new physics. I mean, I could understand maybe relativity theory, right? Especially if we're talking about general relativity, because general relativity is talking about the warping of space and time, and that's Einstein's answer to, how gravitation works. Whereas his special relativity about light, and especially the constant speed of light, which is very interesting. Actually, when I first read that paper many years ago, I actually had a dream about it, which was really cool. But and even Newton, classical concepts, but they're saying that even quantum electrodynamics and quantum mechanics are referred to as classical concepts. Although there's a lot to learn from them, though, if you're one of these people who thinks of the same thing. But quantum electrodynamics was developed by Richard P. Feynman. And he actually has a really good book. It's short, small, but it's packed with information, called QED. And it's a really, really great book, Quantum Electrodynamics. But let's continue. So he's saying that those things are referred to as classical concepts, and that is that they are regarded as terribly outdated. Continuing, according to Ray, unlike today's classical physics, the new physics does not begin with physical observables in developing its treatment of physical phenomena. Rather, it postulates the existence of an underlying reality consisting of an inherently unobservable subtle substance called an ether, or spelled E-T-H-E-R, or alternatively ether, spelled A-E-T-H-E-R, which fills all space. It then defines all of its fundamental quantities at that subphysical level. Physical observables then emerge as mathematical solutions to equations defined in terms of these more basic ether processes. I have to stop there for a moment because this right away reminds me of something that has actually been connected, because I've been hearing his name in connection with this lately. with the whole electrogravitics process. And it's Dr. Edgar Mitchell, the sixth man to walk on the moon. What was he? Apollo? I forget which Apollo research he was on. But Dr. Edgar Mitchell also was one of the founders of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which the last time I checked, a year or two ago, Dean Radin was the head of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which led me to carry out my own experiments using random number generators and a screen recorder that I did publish on my website, UniquilibriuM.com. But what this reminds me of is that in the video for this stuff with Dean Radin, that last research that I saw him talking about, this reminds me of what he just said right here. He says, according to Ray, unlike today's classical physics, the new physics does not begin with physical observables in developing its treatment of physical phenomena. Rather, it postulates the existence of an underlying reality consisting of an inherently unobservable, subtle substance called an ether. Now, this is interesting because in the Institute of Noetic Sciences, with all the research that they've done with these random number generators, which, by the way, I repeated this experiment and I got videos, and I did it even while I was drunk, and I had headphones on giving me prompts, and I was able to, at least it seems like it, to influence or steer the direction of whether the random number generators would either give a 0 or a 1. But besides my drunken experiment that I did when I used to have issues drinking, getting back to the United States from China after all kinds of other stuff happened, but experiment I still feel was successful, was that in the video that Dean Radin produced and was talking on, he talked about going from how we normally think of things as, for example, starting with mathematics, then physics, then chemistry, then biology, and then psychology, and then going into philosophy and metaphysics. He proposed instead to take metaphysics and put that as the foundation, right? So you have metaphysics, philosophy, right? Then math, physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, right? So metaphysics should be the foundation. This is something similar here. It's because it's the existence of an underlying reality, right, which is the metaphysical reality. So I find that interesting, and also the fact that lately in a lot of this anti-gravity, gravity research and interstellar travel, and even this other stuff about non-human intelligence, I've heard Dr. Edgar Mitchell's name thrown out around there, and now this is kind of coming full circle for me because I'm finding this quite fascinating. But, all right, so it says, this new physics regards time and space as absolutes and views Einstein's notion of relative time and space as fundamentally incorrect. Physically observable phenomena, such as length contraction and clock retardation, which relativists normally interpret as alterations of the space-time continuum, emerge as manifestations resulting from motion through the absolute ether. Thus, the ether concept, so long spurned by the academic establishment, turns out to be central to this highly classified new physics. All right, I'm going to end there for now and continue with this anti-gravity propulsion. I'm going to take a break and then just do another one here, but this is some interesting stuff. So we again looked at the work from 2003, in June 2003, the paper from the Army Research Laboratory, which is force on an asymmetric capacitor. And then about a little bit more than a year later, a year and 4 months later, NASA did their research on asymmetrical capacitors for propulsion, and then that was followed up by the researchers from Brazil and Portugal, titled Study on the Influence that the number of positive ion sources has in the propulsion efficiency of an asymmetric capacitor in nitrogen gas. And again, the Army Research Laboratory did not understand how the force was generated. They referred to the Byfield-Brown effect and T. Townsend Brown. The NASA research then referenced the Army Research Laboratory's paper and T. Townsend Brown, but then they found that electrostatic forces were in effect here, and then finally the last paper confirmed that it is electrostatic, and that in fact it's, to me, very similar to the photoelectric effect and the same thing that is operational in the photovoltaic cell. So it's very similar to how solar power works with collisions. So all of this is still talking about collisions. So far there's nothing anti-gravity, nor is it, and it's still propulsion. So some of the things that you'll see in the talk about anti-gravity research is that it's not anti-gravity and it's not propulsion, because of the fact that it should not be taking into consideration anything having to do with collisions. Because when we're talking about collisions, as far as propulsion, that simply goes back to, that's Newtonian, right? We still use that for rocket ships. It's the same thing a lot of people know in in popular culture. For every action, there's an opposite reaction. You explode a fuel through a nozzle in a certain direction, and it hits the ground, and it pushes back with the equal and opposite force, and that's how you get thrust, right? So this is really no different. All what they found here is that none of this violates any of the most basic laws of physics so far, but we'll continue later with the secrets of anti-gravity propulsion and see what they say and see if we can make any sense of it based on that. Now remember, the Army Research Laboratory paper that we have here is June of 2003. The NASA paper on capacitors for propulsion is October of 2004. 4 years later is when this book, Secrets of Anti-Gravity Propulsion, was published. But then after that, in 2010, you had the Portuguese and Brazilian research paper confirming what NASA said about, and I'll end with that statement, right? What did they say? It says the physical origins of the force that acts on asymmetrical capacitor is electrostatic. So it's electrostatic, and it's electrostatic collisions, and that is where we'll end right there. So we'll take a little bit more at the gravity research, anti-gravity, electrogravitics, electrohydrodynamics, and magnetohydrodynamics. We'll continue in the next, and maybe we'll even get into some fun non-human intelligence stuff and see if we can find some more clues there.